Thank you everyone for being here, for attending today's workshop, which is the second in a two-part series co-hosted by UW Chemistry's Diversity and Equity Steering Committee and the Chemistry Education Group. It's under the Equity in the Classroom and Research Labs workshop series. The workshops, today's workshop and building on last week's workshop at the same time, are focused on making course learning outcomes more transparent to our students and implementing a grading scheme that enables all students to succeed. Before I introduce our speaker again, I want to acknowledge, as the University of Washington, the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And with that, I'm really honored to welcome today's speaker, Professor Santiago Toledo, an alum of our department, and currently an associate professor and chair of the chemistry department at St. Edward's University in Austin. He maintains an active research group focused on bio and organic chemistry and also conducts scholarship into teaching and learning practices. Today, he will introduce us to specifications grading or specs grading and how it can be employed to provide equitable avenues to success for more students. Please welcome Santiago Toledo.
Thank you, Colleen, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here this afternoon. It is an honor to be here and a pleasure to be here, of course, as I mentioned last week, to be amongst people that I consider my mentors, people that supported me in my career when I was doing my PhD there at UW. So it's wonderful to be here, at least virtually. And I'm sorry that I'm interrupting a beautiful afternoon in Seattle because, in May it can be a little dark sometimes there. So I will let you go in an hour, hopefully, and you'll have some ideas to go enjoy that afternoon and get inspired. So thank you. I'll get started. So I'm going to share my screen quickly with all of you. So today the focus of our time together is going to be on thinking about alternative ways of assessing or grading students in ways that we can hopefully use that and leverage that to support a little bit more targeted learning for students and maybe giving them more opportunities in order to find pathways for success. I mentioned last week, but I want to reiterate that my background is not in chemical education research. I don't do that work. I have never been trained in that work, so I'm not necessarily as familiar with the ins and outs of that. I'm more of a practitioner that comes at the classroom from having, the opportunity to be in the classroom quite a bit of time, but also thinking about how can the ideas or the things that I do in my classroom could be actually turned into some important advances for the scholarship of teaching and learning. I got my PhD from UW in 2009 in bio and organic chemistry, and then immediately after that, I went into an academic job where I was teaching very heavy loads, like we're talking about 4 to 5 classes per semester. So that was sort of where I got my start in academia. And now I'm at another private liberal arts university, St. Edward's University in Austin, where I also have heavier teaching loads, but a little bit better balance between the research and the teaching. And this work that you'll see is work that I started at my previous institution. It kind of got solidified a little bit here at St. Edward's, and is work that I continue right now implementing in my classes. So with that, Colleen already mentioned, so in the chat, you'll find a landing site for today's workshop or for our today gathering. We have a Google document for what I call insights and questions. As things keep popping up in your head, you can please populate them in that document. So if you want to have that open, that'll be useful. Even if you think you'll get a chance to ask a question, I think writing that in there could be something that I can potentially expand on later on, and maybe that'll be useful. We have a sort of a document that's kind of called the workshop activities, and that's just going to be a few sort of prompts for the reflections that we'll do as we go along. And then just a document of additional resources that you can refer to later on for your bibliography. So we'll start just really quickly with a brief kind of open for everybody. What do you know about this topic? So if you have any experience with this idea of alternative grading systems, just kind of tell me what do you know about it, or what have you heard about it? And I'll open it up to everybody.
Santiago, do you prefer to take chat questions?
No. Ideally, yeah, sorry, let's unmute ourselves and then just quickly just hear from a few people about what do you know about this idea of alternative grading.
Brandy.
I guess I've heard a bit about ungrading, so de-emphasizing grading and just trying to allow everyone to succeed to their fullest.
Thank you.
I know at Evergreen State College, which is in Olympia, they do evaluations instead of grades, where they give like a narrative evaluation of how well the student did as opposed to assigning them a letter grade.
Absolutely.
That's what
Yeah,
I heard of.
definitely. Thank you. Others? And this is just for me to get a sense, of people's ideas or experience with this.
I remember hearing about it at one of the BCCE conferences, and I found a whole bunch of notes I took listening to you. And I remember thinking it was overwhelming for our kind of department culture and kind of figuring out how to get, a large number of TAs trained when there's so many different things going on. So it sounds overwhelming, but that said, I'm really intrigued. I did go back and read my notes. But yeah, so it's intriguing, but I'm also very curious about just kind of the rollout of something like this with kind of onboarding many, many people on a teaching team.
Yeah, that's a really good, interesting challenge. And I think that my background, of course, is not directly aligned with the size institution as the University of Washington. I teach in a much smaller university. But I'm hoping that some of these ideas, at least some of them, will definitely be translatable. And if not, will be a really good set of things to think about in terms of how do you actually scale up some of these things that I'm going to introduce. Well, thank you for some of those ideas. I know that some of you have read about it or at least heard some indirect ways of thinking about that. So we'll go with that, and I'll show you what we're going to introduce. So today, ideally, here are some of the objectives I have for all of you in the audience. I'll give you a few seconds to read it. So I'm hoping that today we go through some of the motivation and background behind these grading structures. I'll talk about a grading redesign framework that I used in order to do the redesign in my classes. And then hopefully we'll begin a little bit of the reflection piece in terms of thinking how you can hopefully try to implement some alternative ways of grading. And I'll put sort of the disclaimer here that, of course, I'm going to talk to you about a very holistic restructuring of the entire grading structure in my classes. But that doesn't mean that things cannot be done in certain specific sections of your class, right? So some assignments actually could be more prime for redesign than others. So whatever I'm introducing is sort of like the big overall restructuring, whereas that doesn't have to be the case for somebody wanting to implement some of these ideas. So don't feel like the structure is rigid in that sense, that it can be introduced in smaller chunks into your class. So really briefly, let's think about this for a minute. So if you can reflect individually and write down some notes about what is the pedagogical purpose of assessments, what's the point of them? And at the end of that time, I'll just look around to see who would like to contribute some of those ideas you reflected on. So I'll give you 2 minutes to think about that. So what is the pedagogical purpose of assessments? What's the point? Would anyone like to share their thoughts? Please. I can see you in my screen now. So if you raise your hand or you unmute yourself, go ahead.
Hey, this is Sarah. So I think that ideally, we often say that our assessments are evaluating learning of the material. Sometimes that's not the case. It's also that it's not only us in our department that are using our grades. It's often that other departments are using our grades as well. So they're using us as their sorting hat to figure out if students should be allowed in their major or allowed in their courses.
Absolutely. What a great point. The idea that we have constituents outside of our own class, that actually depend on those ideas. And that is sometimes elevated to the point of grad schools, right? I send my students to you, they apply with an idea of what their transcript looks like, right? And that means something. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
I was thinking along the lines of figuring out if the topic needs to be revisited.
Excellent.
Have they learned what I expected them to learn? And do we need to go back?
Yeah, like in terms of formative for the instructor to evaluate whether that's something that needs to be rehearsed again. That's great. Thank you.
I think piggybacking on that, communicating that back to the student as well, not just what I need to revisit, but what they might need to revise going forward to new assessments as well.
Yeah, at the center of the things that we're going to talk about today is this idea of actionable feedback, right? So how can they take what we give them and use that in a practical way so that they can do something about their learning, right? So developing those metacognitive skills so that they can apply further and do something about it, right? Rather than sit on a number and not knowing exactly what to do next. What else?
For me, assessments. Hi, Calvin here.
Hi, Calvin.
For me, I've seen assessments in multiple ways, but I feel like in a large part, it's always been a barrier to access toward higher levels of education. Do I meet these standards to get into an undergraduate school? Do I meet the standards to get into grad school? Do I meet the standards to, get into whatever occupation thereafter?
Nice. I like the word standards. We'll talk a lot about that. That's good. Something we'll expand on. Yeah. And Lutz, please.
I was gonna put maybe a more positive spin on it. So you had listed on your slide homework along with all the other ones. I think homework is a little different because there's no time pressure usually as much, and I sometimes felt when I was a student, if I do homework and it takes, it's hard and it takes a lot of time, but eventually you can kind of feel good about yourself that you can actually use the material you learned to solve an actual problem. So I think there is something very rewarding in homework, being able hey, now I can solve a problem that I would not have been able to solve 2 months ago before I've taken this class.
Yeah, that's an important part of learning, as we talked about last week, and we'll reemphasize this idea of motivation, right? So that it could be set up in a way that increases motivation. Thank you. Lots of good ideas about that. Of course, I think that clearly this is preaching to the choir kind of story. Like a lot of us are thinking we want to leverage the idea of learning with our grading structure, but how do we do that effectively, right? And that's the question, the $1 million question we're all trying to work with. For me, in my reflections, I realized that grading, and I deal now as a department chair with a lot of, not complaints, but this is what I hear from my faculty all the time, right? This idea that long hours, sitting around with lab reports, I'm so tired of doing that. My stack on my desk keeps growing higher and higher, et cetera. That, I don't know if grading needs to be that level of torturous, hopefully for all of us, It also shouldn't be a tool to make students happy or sad. This is not about making them happy, or that's not the point, right? We're giving them feedback that might elicit an emotion, but the ultimate point of the grading is not to do that. This definitely should not be a unidirectional process where we spend all of this time, and a lot of us as instructors spend tons of time providing feedback, and then the student grabs it, put it in the backpack, and it forgets about it for the rest of the time. And that's difficult to observe, right? We all have experienced that, where we dedicate a lot of time to give feedback, and then that doesn't necessarily come back in the form of what do they do. It also should not be necessarily used as a simple, it can be, but it might not necessarily be the best use to use it as a weed out tool, right? This is just a way of cutting people out of my class because I can't afford to have that many people in my class. So I think that beyond that, I wanted to go beyond that as idea. I argue that grading is an underutilized tool in course design and course structure. I think that is something that's kind of taken for granted, and I think it can be leveraged significantly to try to develop metacognition and ultimately to support students in becoming more self-directed, right? So how do they become independent when we are not around to help them and support them in their learning process? My grading also, in my reflections, I also kind of realized that there were students in my class that had managed to sort of cobble sufficient points together to earn a grade that I didn't necessarily think reflected their actual understanding of the material based on my observations of them. There was some sort of a gaming of the system story going on. The students were desperate in trying to figure out, how do I max out on the points? How does Dr. Toledo ask specific questions? And how do I get to a particular point? That might be an extremely cynical and exaggerated point of things, but there was a lot of that gaming going on. And the conversation that was happening between me and my students was more about, how do I get more points back? Or how do I get into extra points or more points on my homework, rather than thinking, did I actually learn that or not learn that? So that was a little bit frustrating as I was thinking about grading structures, and I wanted to do something about that. So last week, we discussed this idea that we can establish course structures around the idea of learning objectives. In my class, I used this framework called Marzano's Taxonomy of Learning to write learning objectives. And the idea of introducing this idea of learning objectives before we start talking about grading is that this actually was the starting point for me. I didn't just go about changing my grading and then think about SLOs, but instead, once I had the framework of SLOs well developed around Marzano's taxonomy, that launched me into a quest to think, how do I now leverage this really well articulated SLOs into giving students more effective feedback? Marzano's taxonomy, I'll just do a quick reminder of things, is this idea that it's a taxonomy of learning, structures in a hierarchical way between lower order thinking, which are these two levels of learning, and higher order thinking, the top two levels over here. The idea here is that I've created sort of a structure, a framework for the class where the students are introduced to the taxonomy and introduced to the learning objectives using the taxonomy. And now what I'm hoping to do is to use this taxonomy to distinguish for them this idea of how well they're performing with certain objectives in lower and higher order thinking, and give them even more feedback than simply a number or a grade in an exam like an 83 or an 85, right? So going beyond that. So the kicking off point for all of this redesigning grading was the idea of writing the learning objectives according to the taxonomy. So what we came up with my colleague, again, Justin Dubas, like I mentioned last week, is a colleague that worked in the economics department there at my first institution. We developed this idea of we looked through multiple different grading structures and started to sort of get familiar with some concepts that really worked for our purposes. One of them was this idea of standards-based grading. So it's a grading structure that focuses on giving feedback to students based on very well articulated course objectives. So that fit really well with what we were hoping to do. And some of the features of this idea of standards-based grading are that the SLOs are the center of the feedback. So everything is given back to students in terms of feedback according to SLOs. And that the students had opportunities to reach mastery with multiple opportunities for improvement. That was something that we felt was really important to us. We recognize in ourselves as learners that it was often the case that we didn't learn things immediately, but that it took us some time to get there. So we wanted to honor that for the students and say, how can we embed opportunities for mastery in there so that the students can actually improve and give them chances to improve over time? And the second inspirational work was done by Linda Nilsson. I mean, this book that was published in 2015 called Specifications Grading, which is kind of a buzzword now. I guess if you think about it, it's much more mainstream than it used to be 6 years ago. Specs grading is really fascinating, and I highly encourage you to read the book if you're interested on this. It's really interesting in that what you're trying to do with specs grading is setting clear criteria for the different grades in your class. So instead of basically grading students based on decreasing quality of performance, you instead are telling them what is their highest quality performance they need in order to achieve a D. What is their highest quality performance they need in order to achieve a C, etc. Right? So by clearly stating, here's where you need to be if you want this particular grade, those specifications, you're no longer grading on the grading quality. You instead are saying, this is where I want you to be if you want that particular grade. One of the things that does is actually provide students with autonomy, which is really important in the learning process. We want the students to actually be able to choose. We've all had the D's get degrees type students, right? And those students may have the right to choose, right? Like, hey, this is where I want to be in my class. This is what I need to do to perform. Another set of important aspects for specs grading is that what it does is completely de-emphasizes points and partial credit, which is the direction that me and Justin were already going in this direction. We didn't want to be dealing with extra credit, partial credit. Like, I was grading questions and I didn't know how many points to award with some of the stuff that was thrown into the paper, right? My students were throwing things in there and I was sort of forced to give partial credit and say, I guess I'll give you a point for that. And that didn't really feel right because there was clearly no proficiency with the content. So it takes away this idea of point systems and partial credits and takes that away. As I mentioned, students have more autonomy. And then additionally, just like standards-based grading, there's a lot of opportunities for mastery involved in the grading structure. So we published this original work in the Journal of Chemical Education where we kind of blended these two ideas together in sort of the beta version of that. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the evolved version of what we did in that particular work. So sort of the next generation work that we did. This work was recently highlighted in a cover article by Chemical and Engineering News magazine. And I think Colleen was in there as well. So we were both interviewed for this article. But I think this shows you kind of the level of mainstream, how it has turned from when we first introduced it and when we first were introduced by Nielsen, and now is actually becoming something that a lot of people across our community of chemists are starting to utilize across the country. So I propose this idea of a framework. I use these three sort of categories around the framework of how I went about course redesigning my grading structure in my class. The first thing, right, is this idea of the aligning the assessments and the grading by learning objectives. So I wanted my feedback to be focused not on the type of task that they were performing, like a homework or a quiz, but instead on the learning objective that they were achieving. So changing, just kind of pivoting on the language in how I wanted to give feedback for the students was important to me. I wanted to leverage the idea that I had these cognitive levels in Marzano's taxonomy. So I thought that there was another layer of feedback that I could provide my students with that. And then finally, something that is crucial and fundamental to how I want to go about my grading is the idea about embedding opportunities for mastery, as I mentioned many times. So if we look at a traditional grading structure, and when I first started teaching, what they told me is like, put together a syllabus and figure out what your distribution of points need to be, right? How much are you going to charge for your final exam? How much are you going to charge for your term exams? How much are you going to weight homework? Think about how important the quizzes are going to be, and then put some partial credit or extra credit sprinkle around that, right? So that was my training on how to structure grading. And as I mentioned, that's an underutilization of the tool, I think. Some things that we can try, like as a very low hanging fruit, if you think about this from the perspective of using learning objectives, is potentially simply mapping, even if internally, let's say a homework assignment to a particular learning objective. And even if you use this information internally for you as an instructor to figure out how well did a student perform on a particular learning objective, and you're tracking that internally, that level of feedback is huge for us. As somebody mentioned in the audience said, the idea that taking that information and figuring out how do I need to retry that in my classroom, or maybe emphasize it more, or maybe give them more practice on something. So this is kind of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of changing your grading structure, could be simply mapping out the different concepts within your exam, let's say, according to the learning objectives, and finding out from the internal purposes, how are students performing on each of those sections. What I do in my class is that everything is really under the umbrella of the learning objective. So under learning objective 1.1, for example, 1.1 has an associated homework, quiz, exam, and final exam. So everything, the super category here is the SLO, and the assignment are just basically things that feed into that learning objective. So everything is mapped to the SLO in my class. The students get that mapping, so the students know that we are currently engaging in an activity that's related to SLO 1.1, or that the homework that they're going to do that evening is associated with SLO 1.1, or that the assignment or assessment coming up next week is going to be associated with SLO 1.1. So everything is explicitly mapped according to the learning objective. As I said, feedback is given by SLO, not necessarily. I try to de-emphasize the type of assignment as much as possible. There's a lot of benefits associated. There's a lot of benefits associated with this idea of opportunities for mastery that I thought that I mentioned was essential for my grading. As you know, a lot of these things could actually improve student motivation. So if a student doesn't feel like they have to dig themselves out of a hole after they have a really bad exam, that's an important story for getting them back on the horse and getting them try again. This is an idea that can build resilience, right? So the idea of trying over and over or getting opportunities to improve is important. It definitely supports metacognitive thinking. It's been shown to do that. And I have completely anecdotal data that I think that this idea of giving students an opportunity to get better or improve their grade indeed can have an impact in retaining students more. If the students feel like they can be successful ultimately in the class, they might actually stick around to see the end of the movie kind of thing, right? A lot of our students prematurely, at least in my environment, a lot of our students depart our classes. They just leave us prematurely thinking that they're not scientists. I'm not good for this. I'm in a hole. How am I going to get out of this? So I'm out. But I think if we give them an opportunity to get better, perhaps we can make an impact on this idea of retention. So right now, I'm just going to introduce you to the actual structure that I use in my classroom so that you can see how it's actually put together in my class. How does it actually look like? So from a mastery perspective, what I do in my class is that, for example, the homework, which I use an online homework platform system, is set with a specification proficiency number. So what I say to them is, if you reach 80% on the homework, you have reached mastery of the homework task. And that means that you get full credit for the homework. So that has been huge for me in mitigating the whole grabbing for points, right? The difference between an 80 and an 86 is irrelevant, because the point here is to give students as much practice as possible with the material so that they can achieve some level of proficiency with it. So encouraging that happens. I also use an idea from Linda Nilsson's book called the token system, which allows me to give students an opportunity to do homework or engage with the homework if they didn't do it, or if they did incomplete work. So if a student, let's say, got to 70% proficiency, they didn't quite make it there, I can use the token system to give them another opportunity to reach that 80% proficiency. Because for me, it's more important that the student tries the homework or tries to achieve proficiency than they actually get penalized for that, or get dinged for the idea that they didn't make it, right? The same thing for no homework. The students can use actually tokens to go ahead and engage with the homework if they didn't get a chance to do that. In my assessments or exams, however you want to call them, for me, all of those assessments are called checkpoints for learning, right? So I change the language. I don't use the language of quizzes, exams, or final exams. I just call them checkpoints. So at every interaction with the material, when they're doing assessment, the student is just checking their understanding for knowledge, right? How am I doing so far in my understanding for knowledge? So they're seeing that multiple times during the semester. The grading in these checkpoints are done based on a pass-fail modality, so no partial credit is awarded for them. And then every assessment that they take is an opportunity to reach mastery, meaning that they're not penalized for failed attempts early on, and they can do this up to 3 times during the semester. So for any given SLO in my classroom, I have these 3 sort of assignments, right? Every SLO is distributed with homework, a comprehension level checkpoint or assessment, and an analysis level checkpoint. And the students, as I mentioned to you, in this kind of categorization of these specs, can have to do the homework at greater than 80% to get the spec or the points for the homework. They have to pass completely without any major errors to get the credit for the comprehension checkpoint, and the same thing for the analysis checkpoint. And all of those 3 they can retake up to 3 times during the semester. Because I have the opportunity and the privilege to do this, most of my experience is working with constructive response questions. So I don't have a lot of experience with multiple choice questions, but that's how I do my exams. So in this particular SLO, students can earn this point value system, right? Where if they get proficiency on homework, they get 0.5 credit. If they get proficiency on comprehension, 1.75, and analysis, 1.75. This distribution of point is such that a student cannot pass my class if all they do is homework and that's it. That's not sufficient to earn a D in the class. And is also not sufficient to earn an A in the class if all they can do is think at the comprehension level. If they can only perform at the comprehension level on the homework, that is not sufficient to earn an A or a B in my class. Actually, that gets them to a C+ in my course. And that's kind of my criteria or specification for how I do that. Additionally, this framework is not a stranger for you to be able to design additional learning objectives that have other specifications for what you might want to do in your classroom, like reading the scientific literature, doing collaborative learning, or doing oral communication. You can also create your own SLO in there and create your criteria and then be able to embed it within the formal structure. So you can imagine now sort of an example gradebook for SLO 1.1 for a given student, where the student did the homework, didn't do well on the first comprehension attempt, checkpoint 1, but did it and got proficiency on checkpoint number 2. In my class, they don't have to retake checkpoint number 3 if they get proficiency, so they get the credit. And in the analysis, the students struggled throughout the semester, and at the end, in the 3rd attempt, they actually got proficiency. So in the end, a student that potentially was failing the checkpoint initially, right, zeros at the beginning, ends up succeeding entirely in that particular SLO because they had multiple opportunities to improve without a penalty necessarily. And then, of course, you now have a chart of proficiency for this student where you can tell them, hey, on SLO 1.1, your comprehension was great, but your analysis is not quite there. And you have an additional layer of feedback that you can provide for students.
And
I share this.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The comprehension and the analysis, these are two different kinds of questions that show up in quizzes and exams.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for, no, and it's not interrupting. I should have made it more clear that it's okay to absolutely ask questions. Yes. So those are two different types of questions, and they're mapped to the cognitive level type of the question. So I'm trying to target a different cognitive level with regards to the same content topic, but you're just kind of like shooting a little bit different in those two questions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So your grading structure now has additional layers of feedback that you have for both you and for the students by cognitive level, by SLO, by even type of assignment if you want to do it that way, but you have now these additional layers. I wanted to share with you briefly some anecdotal results from a general chemistry class that I taught in the past. What you can see is that, for example, when students go from the first attempt to the last attempt of the SLOs, they improve significantly. So in the end of the course, the students are actually performing much better on the different SLOs, of course, because they're attempting it multiple times and they have opportunities to grow. What I do see, and it's a question that I get a lot of the times, is that we see some grade movement into the A's and B category. So some people might call that the idea of grade inflation, but I'll show you some evidence that this is actually not grade inflation. There is movement, of course, into the success rates, but not necessarily associated with grade inflation. And the reason why I can say that, let me see. Sorry, my DFW rates also anecdotally again, and this has been consistent for the semesters that I've used this, plummeted initially in general chemistry, but my numbers tend to be fairly low compared to averages in the department. Students tend to stick around to succeed in the class. When we do the ACS standardized exam for our students, and that's why I was talking about the lack of grade inflation, my students perform equally well or a little bit better than the rest of the students in the department when it comes to the standardized assessment, even though they're succeeding at much higher rates than in other courses. So anecdotally speaking, there's some numbers there that suggest that the students gain something from sticking around and hopefully doing a little bit better. So that's a lot of talking. So I'm gonna stop for a second because there's been a lot of information. So stop for a second to open it up for questions, just general questions right now, before we sort of bring it home for the session with a little bit of reflection on different things. But right now I'll open it up for everybody. If you want to put things on the chat or unmute yourself, either way is fine.
Lutz had a great question and I wanted to say it and then add to it. So Lutz said, over what time frame do those repeat attempts occur? And I guess my follow-on question then is, if there's material that's presented toward the end of the term, is there time for them to take a repeat?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that I use my timings for the assessment is that in the past, I used to have a time for quizzes for any given topic, a time for an exam, and then the final exam. So those are the replacement of my 3 attempts. So the timing is that as soon as I'm finished with an SLO, so SLO 1.1, we do our checkpoint number 1. And then when I normally would have done exam 1, where I usually cover, let's say 3 SLOs, they get checkpoint number 2 for that same SLO. And then the final exam is their 3rd attempt. So the nice thing about that is, unlike other structures for specs grading that you see out there, is that it is sort of built in already into a normal course structure because you're just using your normal times to do those assessments anyway. Now, for the very last sets of SLOs, that actually gets a little bit challenging and compressed, especially the last SLO, where in some cases I have to do 2 attempts in the final exam. I've had to do that where the students have 2 different questions there. So 2 different opportunities, you could say, or I try to do them back to back in the last couple of weeks of the class, basically, where they see the checkpoint and then they see it again almost immediately. So yeah, that's a little bit compressed there at the end. Mm-hmm.
So effectively on each of your checkpoints, it's cumulative at each point in a sense, because it's always including questions that are looking backwards in the course. Am I interpreting that correctly?
So when a student enters a checkpoint day, like an exam day, they only have to do those checkpoints that they have not developed proficiency on.
Okay.
So for example, if we get to exam number 2, at that point, they're not going to see SLO 1.1 again because they've already would have seen it twice. So in exam number 2 is not showing up one more time. And at that time, they only get to attempt or try the things that they still don't have proficiency on.
is it tailored to each individual student?
No, so I print I share with them via PDF in this recent year, the entire set of SLOs that they have covered for that particular exam, and they just work on the one that they actually need to work on. They don't have to work in all of them. The same thing for the final exam. So the final exam, all of it is presented to them, and they only get to try, or they only have to attempt those that they don't have proficiency on. So another thing that is nice about that is that it only allows the students to improve, rather than creating this scenario in which the final exam becomes this super high pressure situation. The student is engaging with content that they only want to improve on. So the goal of that is saying, if you like your grade, you stick with your grade based on your proficiency. If you don't like your grade, come and try the things that you don't know yet and do them better. In the past, it was interesting to see that the students were attempting things that they knew really well because they were maximizing points rather than going and tackling the things that they didn't know in the past. So this is, to me, an interesting feature of doing it that way too.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lutz.
So Sarah posted a great question in the chat, so that's why I wanted to ask it. And that is, so when students have these repeat attempts on the same SLO, do they get different question from the same SLO, or do they get the same question?
Different questions, same exact SLO. Yeah, so the goal is not to give them, because eventually if you give them the same question, and it's possible, and an instructor could decide to do that, you get more familiarity with the concept and the question. So then the increased performance then becomes associated with nothing but familiarity. And as you learned from last week in the Marzano's taxonomy, things begin to drop in level the more familiar and the less cognitive control they have to exert over a particular question. So it's a little tricky that way. And I think that's why, unlike other spec systems where they do multiple attempts, where you have to create up to, who knows, some people do like 6 different versions of the same exam. In this case, I'm limiting it to 3 because otherwise it becomes completely unmanageable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And just to make sure I understood the last point you made correctly. So you still have a final exam,
yes,
which could cover all SLOs of the entire course, but students effectively only have to do those parts of the final exam that they had not mastered previously. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's correct. Yeah. They get to choose however many or however few they want to try, or just to choose to keep their grade as it stands at the end of the semester.
So a student who has already reached mastery in all of them, he doesn't have to show up for the final effect.
Right. At that point, the student, if they had reached mastery at that point, they would not have to show up. There are other systems that you will see out there, and I think there's a very good argument to be made about that instructors can require 2 times mastery over a particular SLO. And I think that that's a really interesting argument, because for some people, it's not sufficient to just have them succeed once and then that's it. I think that there's a case to be made about retention of content if you ask them to get mastery more than 1 time. So there's ways to embed that within this structure, where you would tell the student, in order to get proficiency, you need 2 times to demonstrate proficient level. That's one way to try that. Mm-hmm.
I have a logistical question. Go ahead,
Andrea. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was just going to ask, so what does that look like for your exam session? So let's not talk remote learning where we might have, a greater window of opportunity, but let's say you're in the in-person version. So what does that look like for students that are needing to make up multiple SLOs or demonstrate mastery of multiple SLOs in terms of time engaged with the assessment?
Yeah, and that's where it becomes crucial to think about the amount of learning objectives per course. And we talked about that last week, and the importance of trying to think about shading off content and thinking about what is really essential. In my general chemistry class, which is the class with the most number of SLOs that I teach is 11 learning objectives. In my advanced inorganic class, I have like 9 learning objectives. And in organic chemistry, I also had something like 10 learning objectives. So it depends on the class, but let's say that's the number. So for any given checkpoint day, which is the equivalent of an exam, the students are not really attempting more than 3 or 4 at most checkpoints, right? Or SLOs that they're actually working on. Now on the final exam, technically the numbers become fairly tight in there in terms of like their ability to complete those 22 questions, let's say, right? Associated with the different SLOs. But it is rare the case that a student has to do all of them at the final exam. And if they do, let's say a student enters the final exam with an F, it is also very unlikely that that student is going to be able to complete all 22 proficiently during that time frame. So I do see many cases where the student is actually moving from an F to a D or an F to a C, moving into the success area. but logistically speaking, it becomes much harder if a student has not had any proficiency, and that's actually kind of rare that a student lands in the final exam with an F with 0 proficiency. It is quite rare. So it ends up working itself out. Some students choose and opt not to try some SLOs that were actually very difficult for them, and they're like, you know what, I'm going to stay away from that particular concept. I think that even though that's problematic for us in the second, third semester courses, it is important for them to recognize and acknowledge that they're making that choice. And for us as instructors to say, okay, well, you really did terrible on that SLO. You need it next semester. What are you going to do about it? You can't just show up to my class and expect that things are going to be great. But, anyway, there's more feedback there. Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah.
And a follow-up to that did you say you don't do multiple choice?
I don't have a lot of experience. No, I don't do multiple choice because I just have I have the freedom to be able to do a lot of constructive response, and that's worked for me. But I've been really fortunate to be able to work with Colleen's team right now and kind of think about how multiple choice can fit into this framework. And my colleague, Justin, that I mentioned earlier, he used multiple choice in his economics exams. And the way that he would actually tackle it would be that he would put, for example, 4 multiple choice questions per SLO at the comprehension. And in order to reach proficiency, he would ask him to get 3 correct out of the 4. So for him, his spec was 3 out of 4 in a particular SLO in multiple choice means proficient. So he would only give credit on that checkpoint if they managed to get 75% of those questions for that particular cognitive level in that particular SLO.
That makes a lot of sense, because you can imagine a student guessing on a single multiple choice. You don't want to count that as proficiency, but correctly guessing on 3 out of 4 would seem to indicate
a little bit better. And
a little bit, either very good guessing.
Yeah, and that's your spec. That's where the spec comes in,
Yeah.
where the instructor makes a decision of saying, what I think is proficient in my class is this level, right? It could be 4 out of 4, and that's perfectly fine. That's the instructor's decision and prerogative, right? In my case, I don't do any partial credits. So so we do a lot of constructive response, essay, diagrams, etc. So what they're writing is what I'm evaluating, and I give no partial credit. Like if they have a major error in conceptual understanding, I just say, nope, that's not proficient. I give them some feedback on that, and they come at it again on the second attempt or the third attempt. Yeah.
I found that actually grading longer response questions on a pass-fail basis is much, much easier than grading partial credit on long responses, because as an instructor when it's right and when it's not. And then, especially in Gradescope, it's very easy to give the same comment over and over and over again to students.
It's much more sustainable from a logistical standpoint of how do you extrapolate this into larger classrooms, or for example, teaching and training TAs. If you do it based on criteria of proficiency versus non-proficiency, that criteria can be a little bit clearer, much better articulated, rather than trying to explain, for this type of question, you give them 1 point. If they answer this type of things, you give them 2 points. If you answer, that becomes very challenging, as you all know, right? Getting into that point and now how do you award 1 versus 2? And my students were constantly like, I want 2 for that. My friend got 1. And I'm like, well, I guess I give you 1. I'm not, it was hard. Yeah.
I also just wanted to point out one more thing, which is when your overall mastery, like your data, when your overall mastery of the material stays even constant with other students, but your DFW rate drops dramatically, that says a lot. You are retaining students who normally would have been completely shoved out, and you're actually bringing them up to the same proficient level as other students. And I think that's really powerful to keep in mind, that lowering the DFW rate means you really are actually teaching students instead of just shoving them out of the system and being like, okay, cool, let's move on.
Yeah, and the qualifier on that is that takes a lot of management on my side, that the students that are DFs at the time where the drop date is coming close, I have to be really clear with them where they are, what it means to actually have a mastery structure for them, and then land on them a lot more specifically, meaning like I'm targeting them and saying, hey, let's have a plan, office hours, let's try to figure out how to do this. So it has to be managed well, because for them, it's kind of like, it could be false hope, right? This idea that, oh yeah, I just do it in the final and I'll be fine. They are not going to succeed in the end. But if once they stick with it and you tell them, I think you still can succeed if you're willing to engage in this kind of plan, I think that's the caveat there, right? That there has to be a strategy for how to how to work with those students once they make a decision to stay, which is amazing. They're staying. But the second step is now, how do we work with them? What kind of feedback do we give them? What kind of modules for training do we give them? In my set, I can work individually, but in a setting like you guys, it has to be a lot more structured, right? So what interventions could be put in place as soon as they say, I'm going to stay? Okay, so now these students need to be in this plan for improvement kind of thing. But possible, I think, absolutely.
So, sorry, I just want to, there was a question from one of the graduate students in the class, or in the chat, Casey Bisset.
I'm sorry, I'm not monitoring that very effectively.
No,
Thank you. Thank you.
That's my job. So from Casey, is there ever a timeline cutoff for the mastery completion? So let's say you teach SLO week 1, and would they be able to complete it on the final?
Yes. Unlike in some high school systems, you'll read about standards-based grading out there. Students are prevented from moving on to the next SLO unless they get proficiency or a particular deadline. I don't have that because logistically it just doesn't make sense for my structure. But there is a recognition from me that if a student is not mastering SLO 1.1, some of that content might actually then build onto another SLO later on. And that becomes a little bit challenging and cumulative for those students. So acknowledging that and just telling the students that I understand you're not proficient there. You have to continue to rehearse. So continuously look back, because you're going to have to get that well before you start getting other things. But unfortunately, I can't set that structure of limiting. You can't get any more until you do this. But there are people that do that, especially at the high school level. Mm-hmm.
So I had a quick question. I'm also going to step in before Let's again. Sorry, Let's. But on your exams versus quizzes versus final, you say you mentioned that there's no distinction between them, meaning, can you say more about what you mean by that there's no distinction between?
In that the cognitive level is a cognitive level. The question cognitive level, the level of complexity, if you want to call it that way, is not changing between a quiz or an exam or a final. The target is already the SLO, which they have in front of them. They know what they're supposed to reach, and the target is the right cognitive level. So I try to move away from the entire quiz, exam, final exam, partially for psychological reasons on my students, and the idea of like lowering the stakes of what it means to take an exam, what it means to take a quiz, what it means to take a final exam. Instead is like, come on and let's check where you are. This is your checkpoint kind of thing. That's my sort of quirky way of doing it. But it took a while to kind of get that language embedded in them, but at some point they stopped talking about exams and things like that. They just think about checkpoints, and that's I think pretty cool. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So you don't even use the term quiz or exam?
Never. No, they don't. We don't talk about that.
Okay. So do you have what would be a quiz, meaning just a fewer number of questions in a shorter amount of time versus an exam? Okay.
No, it's just the same checkpoint structure for all those attempts. Yeah. I just use the quiz time, what I would have normally used as quiz time, to do the checkpoint. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Let's, please.
So based on this last comment, how, from a student's perspective, how is a checkpoint different from a quiz? So do they get a piece of paper with questions and they have to figure out the answer? So from the student, so you may not call it a quiz.
Yeah,
but in practice, it's the same idea.
Yeah, in the practice, it's an assessment. Yeah, in practice, it's an assessment. The idea is that I'm trying not to ramp up the intensity or the feeling about exam versus quiz versus final, which I think I have no evidence, but I think could have an impact on some students when you begin to ramp up that dial of, by the way, we're now at the final and now the end is near kind of thing, rather than, okay, it's another checkpoint. Go for it. Try it again.
Gotcha. I had a question. So we use in our Gen Chem classes this online homework system called Alex, which uses some of those terms, right? That talks about mastery. It has these features built in where students keep working on a topic until they get it right. I don't know, 3 times in a row or something like that. And there's no penalty, no matter how long it takes. And I was just curious what your feelings are about this. Does that go in the right direction? So one of the things I see is that students, they're just willing to put in enormous amounts of time until they get it all right? They put in 15, 20, 25 hours a week, to make sure they get all the topics, what then Alex will call mastered. So I'm not entirely sure if that's how useful that is, or maybe it is. I'm not sure. I was curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that the more, as we know, the more engagement they get with the material, the better, right? So student engaging with the material in whatever way, whether that is supplemental instruction, recitation sessions, office hours, and all of those engagement opportunities are essential. So the mastery opportunities that Alex can provide I think are really interesting and important, because they at least they could be selected by SLOs. I think they are. You can get your learning objectives in there. You get them to repeat a few things over and over. But it's curious what you mentioned in terms of the students willing to spend an enormous amount of time to get it right, because that's where I think the structure of a specification in terms of the homework, in terms of what criteria represents mastery or proficiency, is a really useful tool potentially in saying to them, stop stressing about getting to 96 or 97 or 90. You know, as you said, my students were the same. They were climbing that ladder, 97 and 98, and doing every little possible thing to try to find that answer. And you can't prevent, it's just so much wasted time, in my opinion. Once they get to a certain point, okay, we got it, like move on, let's try something else, you know? So I think that maybe coupling the practice with enough is enough, and maybe limiting how much they actually need to go, because they're stressing about the points. That's what I think, in my opinion, the students are doing. And if we sort of relax them and say, don't worry about that, try it again. Here's just for you, for formative purposes, for you to practice. They also have a choice. That's a little bit of autonomy there in saying, if you want to get better, here's some more opportunities. But so far as I'm concerned, you reached what I think is okay. It's proficient. You know? So yeah,
I think that's a great idea, because like this last hour spent in getting from 99 to 100% should not be spent that way. That's just
at all. Exactly. It doesn't get him any gain. Yeah.
And that I think there's this is all anecdotal, but I think there's been a significant shift in how students approach Alex in the 10 years that we've been using it, because there was never this. I mean, I used to and still say to my students, you know, the point is not to get to 100%. Like, I would not spend all of my waking hours as a faculty member trying to get to 100%, right? There's a diminishing returns. But I am now watching students put all of their time there, so they do nothing else to prepare, and they think that that in and of itself is the tool that's going to get them prepared to take a quiz or exam or whatever it is, you know, again, in our current format. And so they put all of their eggs in that basket, and we all kind of joke, it's not funny, but it is the reality. I mean, we could set our calendars based on the time schedule in Alex, because you can see the peaks right before the deadline or right before the midterms, when they're like, oh, I better get it all done, right? And they're spending 9 hours in a day. And when I say this to them, I'm like, you all are crazy. Like, there's no way that even those of us that are not novice learners in chemistry, like, we can't sit down for 4 hours and work in a system and not make mistakes and not get super frustrated. So the student engagement with that platform has changed, and they're not hearing or getting or whatever the same message that it is a part of what we're doing, and that mastery, there is such a thing as good enough. And so that is part of, I think, the conversation that needs to continue as well, is what does that role, what role does Alex play, especially when we've talked about it maybe being a go-between as we move between different instructors and, you know, some sort of mastery level that we can kind of look at as we're trying to compare different courses and kind of stepping stones into the other content.
Yeah,
I think. I was just wanted to add to what Andrea said, which is there is no such thing as good enough for pre-med students, for pre-engineering students trying to get into a competitive major at the University of Washington. And I think that's why, I think if you lowered the threshold, like for Alex, if you said 80% is 100%, much like the homework that Santiago mentioned, I wonder if you would see less of that, but I don't know.
So I guess the equivalent in your course structure would be, you know, students having up to 3 repeat attempts at an SLO. So how many students do not take advantage of all 3 attempts? It seems like there's no downside to just keep trying. So why does, but not everyone achieves mastery eventually, but does everyone go through all 3 attempts, or do people say after the first attempt, oh, okay, I'm fine with not getting the points for this SLO?
That's a good point. I do see that. I think that they do choose that specifically with certain SLOs and certain major students that are taking my class that are non-majors, for example. They'll be like, you know what, that molecular orbital stuff, I'm never going to get it. I'm going to stop there and good enough. And because there's few SLOs and they're heavy enough themselves, that there is an incentive for them to get to certain grades for them to actually give it a shot. So, but I do see that. I think that there's definitely a group of people that autonomously say, you know what, that's just not going to happen. And I'm okay with that. I think that I used to sort of be really obsessed with the idea of getting everybody to get the best thing and to be chemists and to think chemistry the best way possible. And I kind of gave up and said, okay, I'm going to present you with opportunities to engage with this. Let's see what can you do? I'm here to support you every step of the way. But if you choose not to, then you choose not to. And there's a path for them to succeed, meaning get whatever, let's say a C, they can actually get to a particular grade that they might be looking for without having to do everything that all the other mastery students are going to get to. And finding that balance in my specs has been really nice to try to figure that out, so that I can feel comfortable with the grades I'm assigning for my students too.
Quick things. I want to acknowledge that it's 4:30. So if you have to pop out, no problem. Actually, 3 things. Santiago, do you want to stop sharing your screen? Do you have more slides to show?
I didn't realize that thing was actually on the whole thing. So what I wanted to do is I think that as you see, where are you? What can you see now? I don't know what can you see.
We can still see your shared screen. I think if we want to just keep up with the Q&A. I
think so, because what I was hoping to, I think that it's useful when I do this a little bit longer sort of workshops, it's useful for all of us to begin thinking about these 3 ideas of how does it incentivize learning? How does it incentivize mastery? We have opportunities for that. And maybe there's a room for how to think about SLOs within your grading structure. And then of course, after that, ideally, you would hope that if you do more work with your department, maybe Colleen on this, is thinking about taking an assignment in your class and thinking about how can I just restructure it from a perspective of mapping to SLO or providing more opportunities for mastery or thinking about how the cognitive levels might actually work in this context. So that's what I was hoping to do a little bit more communally, but I think we have a good conversation going, so we can maybe talk a little bit more. And it's nice to see you, Forrest. It's so great to see you. I don't know if you remember me.
Forrest Santiago, it's great to see you.
Wonderful to see you. I was probably in Forrest's first class at the University of Washington in his organic chemistry class, and it was wonderful but intense for sure.
Well, if you were in that first 431, 531 class, I mean, you're a survivor, man.
I believe it was the first one, maybe your second one. It was there 2004, right? So that must have been your first one, maybe.
2004 was the first one. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So I don't know if you remember it more or less than me, but the first exam I gave, the mean score was like a 31 or something like that. So
I'm sure. I'm sure that's been ingrained in my brain. Yes, it was not good. I learned that I didn't know organic chemistry that day, and I needed to go master some concepts.
Well, and I learned that my writing of exams was completely mismatched to what I thought I was teaching. So, but I did have a question for you, which is, does this have any effect at all, one way or the other, on sort of the age-old question we get in organic classes about needing practice exams and the sort of race we have back and forth with them, in which they want to see sample questions so they can prepare for those questions. And in preparing for those questions, they're kind of trying to do an end run around the actual learning objective itself.
Yeah.
Does the learning objective system help you avoid some of that, or do you still see the same kinds of things?
Because of the repeated measures and because there's only so many ways to modify the questions, yes, I think that there's some of that's taking place. The cognitive levels absolutely are really helpful in that the analysis level questions are much harder to come around or to try to really trick or not, or do some sort of workaround on that. So having the cognitive level on its own has been a really interesting, I wouldn't call it barrier, but a really good prevention mechanism from that familiarity trick that they're trying to play in there. And not on purpose, but it's saying, look, I expect that you think at higher order thinking so that you can move on with that content. So I'm going to put a structure in place so that you can reach those higher levels intentionally. So that has been a useful tool, but it hasn't gotten entirely away from what you're describing. I think that is a challenge. But the fact that they can see it multiple times, I do want to say that anecdotally that my students, that first attempt, a lot of them come in and just come cold at it and just kind of put something down, hoping to get familiarity with the question. Like, oh, I'm just going to look at the question and see how things are going to go. So I do see a lot of that actually on the first attempt. I tell them that's a wasted attempt, but some students actually go about doing that.
So then just to follow up a little bit, do you provide them with practice problems at all, or is it they have to show up in order to see what the problem looks like? So
because again, the context in where I work in, I do have the ability to write exams every year. All my exams or checkpoints from previous years are available to them, so they actually have some accessibility to those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So great to see you again.
Thank you, Forrest. And that was the third thing I was going to mention, is that I wanted to acknowledge Forrest's question, because I saw his hand go up. Follow up from Samantha in the chat. Do you get any student pushback about whether a particular question was too hard for an analysis or comprehension SLO?
No, that's been awesome. I mean, the fact that I can categorize him, I explain the cognition levels, and I can put it in there. I don't get that as much as I used to anymore. Like, he was like, oh, that question's ridiculous. I'm like, well, you have the SLO, you know the target cognitive level at which I was aiming, and you knew it was going to be this type of question. So absolutely has totally shut down any of that story. Yeah, it's been nice.
That's great. And just on that, and then reflecting on a question we got last week about the time it takes to teach students about like zanos and Specs grading, like how much formal instruction time do you spend teaching them about what is the difference between comprehension versus analysis, and how does that go over with them?
Initially you have to introduce it, but there's a little bit of on-time teaching that has to happen. The students don't care that much until the first assessment comes along, so the first checkpoint. So after the first assessment, there's a good opportunity to then remind them of those cognitive levels. That's the first time they actually, I think, really listen to me about that. It's like, it's a nice story initially, and they're like, oh, yeah, we get it. And then it's not until the first assessment where I'm like, notice the distinction between the two questions. One, you're actually making sense of existing knowledge. The second one, I was pushing you to do extension of your own knowledge or your understanding. So it definitely gives you opportunity to do a little bit of workshop as soon as you finish that first checkpoint. And that is then something that I just constantly use as a language that I use in my class. So it's not like I dedicate a ton of time, but it's more like a constant reminder that has to be present in students' minds. Now, whether they actually officially totally now understand the learning structure and how those differentiate, not so much, but I do hear him use those in both my instructor evaluations and talking to me about other classes that they're taking, in terms of like, oh, that test right there in my whatever class was full of retrieval questions. So that actionable use of the language is kind of neat to see actually in students. So some of that is actually happening for some of them, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Santiago, Scott has a question in the chat, and I have the same thing. Would you be willing, kind of to get at that, would you be willing to bring up one of your documents so we could just see what like information is given with one of your questions, that kind of so where it identifies the SLO or whatever? Are you leaving for Little League? Bye.
No, not yet.
Oh, all right, bye. Then don't buy. All right.
Yeah, I think I should be able to do that if that's useful for everybody right now. If not, I can always drop it into the website. Let me see. Okay, so how do I get out of this? Sorry.
Sorry, I really put you on the spot. Yeah, I was just trying to wrap my head around what that might look like from the student perspective.
So I'm not sharing, right? From you guys' side, I'm not sharing. Why am I stuck? There we go. So I'm going to pull something up. Let's see. I can take another question in the meantime while I try to think about this. There you go.
Quick question. How much time do you have to give us today?
I committed Colleen to an additional half hour from when we were supposed to finish. So I'm happy to stay,
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to acknowledge that this is beyond the official session. Thanks everyone for hanging out. And
Yes, and thank you so much for your time and for being here.
yeah. So did I see your hand go up?
Yeah, if you just have a minute to bridge here. So we mentioned earlier that at least here at UW, other departments have certain expectations what grades mean, and they use it as a sorting hat of for various things. Did you run into this? Did you have to coordinate with other departments? Did other departments, were they surprised all of a sudden that the grading has changed? Different or more people, I guess, pass the course.
I have gotten some questions about what's up with the grade distribution, and it was really nice to be able to show them the standardized exam results to show that the success rates were also correlated with stronger learning. So that immediately mitigated some of those challenges. But I don't have as much accountability in terms of thresholds in order to get into a particular major. I also do not impose this on anybody in my department, so I use it in my classes. But we are now beginning to embed mastery-based learning in all of our laboratories, and that has gone really well. This is now the second year, so 3 semesters now that we've embedded that, and the students are really, really supportive of the idea of being able to do a lab report multiple times in order to improve and get eventually mastery of what it means to write a discussion or whatever. So that's actually gone really well for us. Mm-hmm. And it's been taken positively by the students. But no, I don't have as many constraints. It's been nice to have that level of freedom.
Sarah, I think you had your hand up. You were fighting with Lutz, and then Jasmine, and then Calvin. Thank
you. One of the things that you described was having students describe their knowledge or explain a concept. In my own grading, I used to a long time ago give questions where I asked students to write something, and I found they took me forever to grade. It was really difficult for me to grade. So are all of those assessments in the form of an explanation? I mean, I could also imagine that they could be a longer problem where you can look at it and then instead of giving partial credit, you can get pretty much a sense of whether it's above bar or below bar.
Yes. Yeah, so they're all extended answers, like either essays or diagrams or explanations or whatever way they want to communicate that. And yes, it's about sort of looking holistically and seeing the main concept that I was trying to test them on from the SLO that I'm trying to target is completely not there. Like it's missing. Like that error is happening very clearly from the answer that they provided. Why they might have provided some beginning stages to it, my expectation is that they actually meet that standard of they actually get that particular concept. And it's actually fairly quick. The grading is quick, especially as you were saying with pre-filled comments, that things that somebody was saying that you can repeat over and over, being able to see something kind of holistically as an expert. And I think that a lot of us have that ability that we can just kind of say, okay, that's definitely not there. And this is why it was missing. This was what was missing. I don't know if that answered your question, Sarah, but it has significantly optimized my time. I guess it's not really taking me as long as it would have taken in the past.
But it sounds like it's writing and diagrams, not problem solving.
No, it can be problem solving. Yeah, absolutely. Problem solving. But in that case, for example, there are some things that are like minor errors, especially with arithmetic, right? So in the lower level classes, and maybe not in the physical chemistry classes that you teach, potentially that's much more complex. But the arithmetic stuff that is clearly something that was a miscalculation or something that is not fundamental to the conceptual understanding of the idea is not counted as a major error. And they actually can earn proficiency because it's like, okay, I recognize you like totally missed a decimal there, but that's kind of irrelevant at this point in this question. So I give them the credit for having mastered that, for example. So let me just show you an example really quickly. So this would be sort of the structure. Can you guys see there's a Word document there? Yeah, okay. So this is checkpoint SLO 1.2b, which is the second attempt. The SLO is atomic properties and periodic trends. So the students, know that that's what's happening right here. They know the cognitive level that they're addressing. And in this case, it's a multiple, I guess A and B, multiple part question. To get proficiency, they have to get both parts correctly because both parts are trying to address the SLO. And then if we look at the analysis level, again, it's labeled. In this case, they have A, B, and I think that's it. and they're trying to get proficiency by answering both of those questions. And they get frustrated at me because of his multi-part. They're saying, well, I got part of it right. I say, you have to still try the whole thing, because I'm trying to sort of package the SLO within this 2 or 3 parts of the question to try to evaluate your level of proficiency with it. And I tell them that is good news, because you partially might know already part of the content already. You're not necessarily starting from scratch. You just have to kind of come back at it and try it one more time. So this is my structure. This is a checkpoint for an SLO. So not a lot of questions, because I'm not doing multiple choice. This on its own takes 15 minutes. So I dedicate 15 minutes of class to this right here. And that's sufficient for them to actually complete. It's actually more than sufficient for them to complete that particular question. And they're developing the answer, right? By providing an explanation, showing me how they arrived to their answer, and I'm evaluating how they're doing. Andrea, does that help? And I'm happy to actually, if Colleen, maybe through Colleen, I can maybe put like collections of assessments of different classes and things. I'm happy to sort of things like that, if that's useful for people.
This was hugely helpful, because I just seen it called out as analysis and comprehension. And again, you've got to be able to set the context for them early in the term, which is always a challenge on the quarter system, because then you have to do it 3 times a year instead of 2 times a year. But, you know, it's trying to, you know, that language is already out there. And so when they see that, that flags for them what they need to be planning to do. So that was really helpful. I appreciate that. Thank you.
And for people that are thinking a little bit kind of starting on this idea, my first iteration of this structure was that my exam that initially was just a bunch of questions randomized across different SLOs. The first thing I did was separate them by SLOs, right? So like SLO 1.1, and then there was a set of questions. And then the second layer of distinction was retrieval, comprehension, analysis, so that the student could see the different cognitive levels and engage with what they felt more comfortable with at the time. And I also weighed them differently. So back when I started, my retrieval was worth 1 point, my comprehension was worth 3 points, and my analysis was worth 6 points. So I was rewarding the higher order thinking significantly more, recognizing that I wanted those grades to be skewed, the A's to be skewed towards the students that can do analytical thinking. So I sort of pushed the students to go in that direction. What we realized was that after actually several semesters of doing analysis on our data with Justin and I, is that the retrieval questions were not really distinguishing between A's and B students really well. There was no correlation in performance and retrieval versus like ultimate grade in terms of A, B's, and C's. It was not doing much for us. So we sort of did away with the retrieval portion of the Marzano's taxonomy, sort of focused specifically on Gen Chem and OChem in the analysis and comprehension sections, and sort of went with those and still kind of kept the label there. So now we have it really explicitly put there, and they have this sheet, right? And now they want to try SLO 1.3. There's a different sheet with SLO 1.3. So I'm really trying to parse out and lower the cognitive load on students so that they can engage with the content a little bit more parsed out there, without that being kind of jumbled in their head. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence that suggests that if you just delineate that for the students, performance can actually improve, so that they're not hunting for where was this at, in their brain. They're having to reorganize everything if the questions are all jumbled together. And remember, like, oh, was that from the first part, from the last part of the class? It can be, it sometimes can be a little bit daunting for them. Mm-hmm. Sorry, was there another question in the?
So from Sarah, was that 15 minutes or 50?
I'm sorry, it was 15. Mm-hmm.
Jasmine.
I always get those two.
I just had a question. Santiago, are you the only people teaching in this manner at a given time? Places like UW and USC, we often have multiple sections of the same class running, taught by different instructors with different approaches. And students are like, wait a minute, how come they've got the 3 attempts to get an A, or in my case, how come they have all quizzes every week and we have 3 major exams, kind of thing. And so I'm just wondering if you had any of that, or if you're kind of all of Gen Chem is taught in this manner.
Finally, it is. I hired 2 colleagues last year, and I was able to nudge them a little bit in this direction. So yeah, general chemistry is now using a mastery approach, and it's been going really well. From that perspective, we receive really good feedback. Students are very excited about the ability to attempt and to succeed eventually. That's not necessarily a problem. They really don't like me because I'm the no partial credit person, whereas my colleagues use the same structure I'm describing, but they actually provide partial credit. But they do it just, which is nice. It's like, You don't do it, you have some level of proficiency or full proficiency. So they actually acknowledge, and I think that's fine. I mean, it's a different philosophy, acknowledge that there's some level of proficiency, but there's no parsing out between 1 point, 2 points, 3 points. It's kind of like a all half or nothing. And I think that's kind of nice. And for them in the student evals, it works really well. The students love it. They're like, oh, I get extra. Unlike that other guy that's, I do get that I'm the mean guy that does no partial credit, but it's just.
And until you reach this point where everyone was grading this way, like, how did you deal with the differences in your sections? Like, how'd you deal with the student pushback? We literally had a petition go all the way to the provost at USC.
Oh yeah. I mean,
they started at the provost.
I've had to earn tenure at 2 institutions now, and in both institutions it was a challenge. It is nice to be able to show increased levels of learning, to be able to articulate how higher order thinking, of course, and the attempt at getting to higher order thinking is something that is valuable for my students. They're just a little bit disappointed at the idea that they feel like they're really working hard to get some of the things written on that paper, and that they deserve a little bit of chance. And I absolutely think that they have a point there. I try to, over the years, I learned to manage that a lot better in terms of explaining them how the mastery structure is really helping them. I mean, it's just a lot of managing that, a lot of coaching and talking and working with that. So it has been a difficult road to get there. Actually, there's been a lot of challenges. I cannot tell you that that's not the case, but I'm super proud to now report that. I mean, students are now always focused. I mean, they're saying things like, this class actually cares about how much I learn rather than how many points I get. This is about the learning. I really feel like I've mastered the concept. So I'm starting to hear things. And I know that not just from evals, but from other things, that students are starting to recognize, oh my gosh, like I'm actually growing, basically personally getting to a better place where I didn't think I could succeed in Gen Chem, but I actually managed to get a C. That's actually good. So it kind of turns its tide on its own a little bit, yeah, I don't know. There's no easy answer for that. It's hard,
Thank you, Santiago. Let me turn it to Calvin.
Thank you. I was curious to hear about the sort of equity side of this method of teaching from the decreased amounts of FDWs. Is there a change, or have there been an analysis of what students are being retained in the group versus that would, under a more traditional grading style, have dropped out? Are we seeing any changes there in the retention, especially amongst underrepresented minorities within chemistry and sciences?
Yeah, of course, those are amazing research questions that we would love to answer. We have not had the critical mass of data to be able to answer that significantly, like where we have enough students to answer that. Our semesters have much less students compared to other universities. But what I can tell you, and I deal really closely with a lot of the students in my department, is that I do see students that for some reason or another, they have not yet, well, a lot of us don't develop that identity as scientists or as potential scientists even, or developing scientists until much later. And sometimes some people need a little bit of a nudge, right? They need a little bit of a, hey, maybe stick around. Let's get through this first semester chemistry. Maybe the next one will be a little bit better. Some of us, as you know, are much more adept to do certain types of chemistry than others, right? So some chemistries tend to be the ones that are like, man, I'm out of here. Like, this is crazy. And that can be a sliver of what chemistry represents, So I don't have any hard data to tell you who's retaining better. We work with student populations of a lot of underrepresented minorities. We're a minority majority institution. I work with a lot of first generation students. Over 50% of our students are first generation. Those are the students that I think communicating that is not about when you learn it, but if you learn it sometime at the end of the semester, that message plays really well with that population. At least I have found that anecdotally. And I would love for more of this. There's no evidence right now, even nationally right now, to show that this is actually something that can curve the retention of those populations. But I would love to start asking those questions formally, because I think you have a great point. I think that to me, access, right? The idea that you can access success all of a sudden that the playing field has been level for everybody. I'm passionate about that, and I'm trying to. This is an attempt of doing that for my students. Yeah. And this doesn't mean lowering the bar. People think is about like moving it. Some people's question. We still have higher cognitive level of thinking. Like we're pushing hard in those higher levels. Like that's not easy, right? These are not straightforward questions that they have to accomplish. So everybody has a high bar. I just have a standard, and my goal is to do something as an instructor to lift them up to those standards. Now, that's the challenging piece for all of us. What structures do we have in place? Is it the ALEX? Is it the conversations with them? Is it the landing on them with modules? Is it, what do we do? That's our task, right? Is trying to figure out what do we provide for them to reach there. And now the student ultimately then finally, if they have all those resources, then they can make a choice, an actual choice to succeed or not succeed. Until then, it's tough. We're kind of,
Thanks for that question, Calvin.
Thank you, Calvin. That's an excellent question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Did I see Sarah's hand go up? Okay, Sarah.
So Jasmine asked this great question, and then you described your answer in terms of like how it might be more difficult for students to accept your way of doing things. I suspect the way that she was describing it was that students would want your way of doing things, and that it might be your colleagues might get pushback that would be difficult to deal with.
It's starting to get that way now.
Okay. How does that play out, and what do you find are useful ways to deal with that?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's starting to play out that way. It's starting to play out that way. My biology colleagues that teach labs are starting to like come and ask me like, what are you doing? What is this mastery thing that they're having to resubmit lab reports? So they're starting to get a little angry about that. We're good. I mean, I don't have a formal way to answer that. I have been fortunate enough to be now as the chair of the department to have really wonderful, supportive colleagues that are interested in my crazy ideas and that are okay with that. And they're also self-confident enough in their own instruction to say, look, that's great. I don't do it that way. I'm okay with keeping it my way. And they have a lot of other support structures they provide for their students to succeed. So they feel like that is sufficient. But it's starting to be, I think for some instructors and some adjunct instructors that are not as used to that, for them it's kind of like a little bit of a shock in trying to go in this direction and a little bit of a learning curve. I don't have a good answer for it. I'm starting to hear that. It's definitely starting to show up in the labs because the students are raving about it. They're like, oh my gosh, like I'm getting a chance to get better at it, right? And we think that's how we do better writing, right? So what I'm asking them to do in my labs is that they're doing kind of like a response to the editor, like we do in journals, right? So they're responding to the instructor saying, here's the feedback that you provided for me. Here's how I'm going to improve. Here's the changes that I made to my manuscript, to my lab report that now I have made. So please go ahead and look and see if it's better. So that letter of feedback or response is like, you acknowledge what I told you did wrong. Now you get back to me what you did wrong. And now we come back and revise that. It's beautiful. It's great. But yeah, I'm sorry. I don't have an answer, Sarah. It's going to become an issue, I think, but I'm okay with that. I'm ready to push.
Thank you. I want to just mention it's 3 minutes till 5 Pacific time, and Santiago's in Central time, so it's even later for him. Are there any final thoughts or comments before we end? Scott.
Good to see you, Scott, again. So great.
Yeah, very, very good conversation. This is all really good stuff. I just want to comment. I really think it's cool that this gets away from a curving perspective of any sort, whether it's linear or not. I always did linear stuff because it would seem a little bit less crushing, but I like that it's just whoever gets mastery gets the grade. And I think it was always a struggle for me to conceive how to do that. And this is a really neat way to look at how those things happen.
And if you're concerned about things getting too easy for them, you'll be surprised how challenging these structures.
Oh yeah, no, I don't at all. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said last time, I think going for this upper level analysis is something that I've always done a lot of, and that is not you're not testing on easier stuff. Yeah, I don't think at all that it's an easier setup. I think it's definitely keeping a high bar.
Parsing it out by SLOs, even that level of explicitness, it still makes a challenge. So it showed me how hard it might have been for them before that, right? Yeah. anyway, I hope that this is some interesting ideas, some things to think about, like as Samantha mentioned, and hopefully just fun stuff. I think it's great, and it's I'm so thankful for the opportunity to have a conversation with all of you again.
Thank you for giving us 2 weeks of your time.
Of course, my pleasure.
This has been really great. Thank you so much. And we'll post these on the department's YouTube page, and we'll make you really famous worldwide.
All right. And if there are more questions or needs resources or anything like that, just, through you, Colleen, just channel them in and we can talk about that.
Will do. Thank you.
Colleen and I are going to hang out for a while doing some question assessment stuff. Yeah. She keeps me honest, and her students keep me honest. They're wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.